Just sit right back and you'll hear a tale of a fateful trip that started from this tropic port aboard this tiny ship. The mate was
the UFOs, the ETs, who's ever out there is just half the problem here. The other half is the government. What are they not telling us? What do they know? It's like we have to play offense and defense at the same time. What are they keeping from us? Who are the people that are in control of this information? So we have a panel of experts here who, they study the phenomena and they have to study the people who are studying the keeping the secrets, studying the people in the know. And it's a strange balance. We who want to know what the truth is are caught between these two forces. And it's very strange, isn't it? That we have to want to know what the alien's about and what's the government about. And these people up here are really the all-stars of our team. That's like I like to call them. They are the Michael Jordans in the league of investigation. So I just want to introduce, yes. I'm Alan Steinfeld. I'm very happy to be associated with these people at conferences after conferences, and it's an evolution. It's not like the same thing. These are researchers on the forefront of knowledge and acquiring knowledge and giving it to people who are, wanting to know. But they've devoted their lives to this, and that's what makes this group, this cruise, these people and their information so interesting. So we have Dr. Desiree Hurtak. She actually has a PhD in environmental sciences and knows a lot about the environment and its interaction and its change. And they've studied Mars. Dr. J.J. Hurtak, who has a great legacy, starting with the Keys of Enoch in 1973. He had quite an experience that you can read about. There'll be books here during their lecture. Kathleen Marden, who actually has the longest history involvement, I think, of most people in this field, of probably anyone in this field, back to 1961, where she overheard the call that Betty Hill gave to her mother, Betty Hill's sister, about what happened to them on their way back to Portsmouth. And so you really hold a great legacy there, Kathleen. And then we have RIchard Dolan, who really is the person that made me want to do this panel, and we'll get into that because of his understanding and history of the phenomena. And Jan Harzan, he's the head of MUFON, and if you want to know what's going on in the public and what people are saying about their experiences, Jan and his organization, Mutual UFO Network, is the key organization, and especially improved since Jan has taken it over. And then the one and the only, really the one and only, Linda Moulton Howe, who has probably, more insiders than anyone have spilled their beans to Linda. If anyone knows anything about it, it's Linda. So I'm really happy you decided to join us today. So I want to start off with the idea, and I really respect RIchard Dolan and his research and as a historian. And then he's coined the term breakaway civilization. He's talked about the secret space program. And, he just doesn't make things up like other people we may know in this phenomena. But RIchard based what he says on his research. So breakaway civilization, secret space program, I want to believe that's true, and I'm not doubting it isn't, but I want to know what you know about it, why you believe in it. So I want you to kick this off and define breakaway civilization and why you think there is such a thing as space.
I'll start with the secret space program, why I think there is one. First of all, if you were at a cocktail party arguing with your ultra-skeptical cousin or uncle, you could say there's definitely a secret space program, if for no other reason that the United States military requires one. So you've got the NRO, and which is the National Reconnaissance Office, which has been going since 1960 with spy satellites that are covert. So we, by definition, have a clandestine classified space program. It's been going for many years. The U.S. military must dominate space as a platform of operations if they want to dominate the war on the ground. And so there's going to be all kinds of classified activity going on in space. Always has been, always will be. American military will never, ever stop that or give it up voluntarily. So the real question is, how far does that secret space program go? That's the question. There's absolutely major classified activity up there. And what we want to know, for those of us interested in the UFO phenomenon, is how far might that program be? Do they use exotic technology that's off limits to the rest of us? For example, have they used reverse engineered extraterrestrial craft, black triangles, and things like this to get out there? And that leads to the idea of a breakaway civilization, which I was really thinking about this for quite a long time. And I always consider it a hypothesis. So I'm not going to go so far as to say I absolutely know that there's such a thing, but I do believe it. I've always believed it. And it's not a hard idea to understand. And then I'll briefly tell you what I think is some good evidence to support it, and then I'll give up the microphone. So I think the idea is, when we understand how the classified world works, there are classified patents, there's classified technology. We understand that. Tom Vallone, who sometimes people run into his work, he does a lot of work on electrogravitics. He used to work in the U.S. Patent Office, and he talked about how he knew when he was there that there were massive numbers of classified patents with energy alone, energy patents that were just off limits to the rest of us. And that's, I think, the norm. I'll never forget a conversation I had with a civilian scientist at NSA from the 1960s who talked about clock speeds on NSA computers in 1965 running at 600 megahertz. Today, that's nothing. But in 1965, that was a very big deal. We didn't reach that speed in the consumer market till around the year 2000, about 35 years later. So the NSA not only was a secret agency, no one knew the NSA, basically no one, in 1965, and they had maybe the fastest computers in the world. So 35 years ahead of the consumer market. And in all kinds of areas, we can recognize that the classified world is way, way ahead of us. So if you take that principle, you throw in ET tech into the mix, acquired technology, you can see how breakthroughs in understanding that tech would be classified. You can see how that classified group would then be racing ahead of the rest of the world, which would be prevented from exploiting those breakthroughs because we wouldn't be allowed to know about them. Those breakthroughs literally would be classified. And you would have a situation where this classified world would race ahead of everyone else. And I call that a civilization that has broken away from our own. What is a civilization? They have different technology, different ideas of the universe, different cosmology, which these people would, if they were able to go off-world with maybe their own versions of off-world craft and encounter beings that we don't ordinarily encounter, gain knowledge that we don't have. That's a different cosmology, a different view of the universe, and I just call them a separate civilization. Doesn't mean that they all live on Mars in Alternative 3. It just means that they have a completely, radically different understanding of things. So I think that's all true, and I think there's a heck of a lot of evidence for knowledge of the space program of UFO/aliens. I think that's very, very strong. We could talk about some of those individuals who come out over the years. Classic whistleblowers, people like Carl Wolf or Donna Hare or Marie Rilke or a number of others who've talked about this back in the 70s, about distinct, definite knowledge, airbrushing UFOs out of photographs, and conversations with Apollo astronauts about being followed by alien craft. Like, all of that has been out for a long time. And I think there's enough of it that we can say, yes, that's true. And then the other side of it is simply recognizing the logic of reverse engineering ET tech. So if you look at Roswell, you look at Cape Girardeau, you look at Aztec, you look at all the others. There was a crash in Las Vegas in 1962. You look at all of these, and you recognize they weren't just sitting on their hands looking at this technology. They were actively working. We have more than enough genuinely, I think, good leaks that have come out that have described how we've reverse engineered that tech. And so putting all of that together, I think you got a really good case that we've got off the record, very advanced technology that's gone off planet. And how far they've gone, I don't have any more exact idea than anyone else.
Have we made it to Mars, or you don't know?
I couldn't say. Maybe other people can speak to that, but I think we can definitely look. Edgar Mitchell, before he died, was speculating. I'll put that in air quotes. That he said, sure, I think it's entirely possible extraterrestrials could have a base on the far side of the moon. Mitchell said that. You've had other astronauts saying equally suggestive things. So I think classified bases on the moon, I would say you have to look for that. As far as Mars, we could talk about that.
Okay.
So that's a good start. How about that?
Okay. You wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I would like to contribute going back to 1988 in Denver. And I got a call from a man who was working at White Sands. He was a meteorologist. He was working for the Naval Research Lab, which has had an office at White Sands going probably all the way back to right after World War II. And the reason that he called me and why I'm bringing this up is when he got in touch with me, it wasn't really anything to do with UFOs. It was that he had seen my film A Strange Harvest, knew the work that I was doing in Denver as the director of special projects at Channel 7. He called me and said, I'm coming to Denver and I want to meet and talk with you about something that I think is really important, and to boil down a very long discussion. He said that this colleague working for the Naval Research Lab at White Sands, where he, the man talking to me, did meteorology, confided with him that we had a base on Mars in a lava tube, and that it had been on Mars in collaboration with some kind of outside intelligence help going all the way back to the 1970s. And that the reason that he wanted me to know is, he said, I have discussed this with a physicist who told me that he's been there 6 times, and that in those 6 travels, the physicist was also working at White Sands with NRL, was talking about how they were in a lava tube in which there had been extraterrestrial guidance that they could blow in something that sealed, and then they pumped in an atmosphere, and that we had been going back and forth.
But how'd they get
Now,
to Mars?
through UFOs.
Through
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
US
But the why he always to me was sort of refreshing is he didn't come from UFO ET background. He was working and wanted me to know about what he was exposed to in his work about this base on Mars. So it was always sort of a separate situation, and it is reinforced what Rich is saying about the 35-year, we'll call it, where our government is at any point, and where we in the public learn, is always that kind of disconnect. And there are so many examples where there are offices and the compartmentalization will be so severe that each office will have a red light. And that, to give you just one more idea, when some of you have heard me talk about a man who was an analyst for the Defense Intelligence Agency, and a meeting that was put together by a man in the World Bank with the man in the DIA in December of 1999. And the reason that the DIA analyst wanted to talk with me is that my third book, Glimpses of Other Realities, Volume 2, had come out at the end of 1998. And all I knew going into the meeting was that he wanted to talk to me about a section in the book. And when we finally had this meeting, we all had to travel. and he was the one who chose the place. And he said that in the 23 years that he had worked for the DIA, from which he was retiring, he said everything was so compartmentalized, office to office to office, that when he received a phone call saying, you need to get this book by Linda Moulton Howe, Glimpses of Other Realities, Volume 2, High Strangeness, and he said, I open up your book to the pages that I had been recommended, and you have a 100-page chapter on a subject that I thought that the world would never, ever hear anything about because we worked so hard to keep this suppressed. And this is about the cloning technology that half a dozen people in the abduction syndrome had sketched, had knowledge about. And he said, we had worked that no one would ever know about this cloning technology. And you have illustrations, you have maps, you have transcripts in this 100 pages. And he said, it underscored for me that part of our illusion in the government trying to always compartmentalize person to person to person in these complex offices, that we in the government, even though we are trying to operate in a policy of denial in the interests of national security, that what we end up doing is creating so many black divisions, and that we are disabled by the fact that there is so much compartmentalization that we end up not understanding, like in your case, that out in the world that we weren't even aware. And that to cap that, one of the executives, without going into name, but I've talked to him about this very deeply in the past year, one of the executives of one of the organizations that you hear a lot about these days told me that in his work in aerospace and looking at where things are today, he said, Linda, one of our greatest disabilities is that so much now is black world, underground. He said the vast majority of the most important things are happening underground in the black world. And we feel we have to get it into the white world if we are going to make real progress.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about the black budgets and all that, but I just wanted to set like this first round into the phenomena in a way itself. And
I'm speaking largely as an independent researcher, but a lot of my work is supported with Desiree. And some of you know one of my doctoral theses was the German aerospace program during World War II, which was then transferred to the United States. So I had an opportunity to know at the very top end the German and American scientists at White Sands. I was the first to publish the documents on Mars, not only the pyramids, but one of the aerospace domes that was brushed out. So we do know that there was behind the scenes, at the very highest of levels from what I can determine, those who were familiar with quote-unquote foreign technology from outside our planetary system that was given to the West in the struggle with the Soviets. This will come out as time progresses with greater substance. So. From what I can determine, there was on a metaphysical level some direct input, and one could argue that the Third Reich was an extraterrestrial experiment. If that was true, then the ET experimentation was passed on indirectly to Great Britain, Canada, and the United States to continue some of this research. I'm saying this very cautiously. And I would like to read a statement from Edgar Teller, because one of my friends worked with Edgar Teller. Of course, some of you know him as the father of the H-bomb. My position is that of Linus Pauling with the teddy bear eyes. I'm for peace, not for war, or certainly not for the misuse of technology. That's right. When Teller states perhaps the main reason for eliminating secrecy is make-believe. It does not work in a free society. It affects our own law-abiding scientists even better from deterring them from participating in the development of super weapons. But secrecy, the path to secrecy, is no obstacles in the way of foreign governments determined to learn it or to rediscover the secret. To put it simply, a secret known to millions of people, in effect, is no longer a secret. So Teller was saying that some of this obviously has to be classified on the highest of levels, even off-planetary operations, because the average person is uninterested in his normal way of life and is not in a responsible position to understand the implications dealing with the whole society off space. Now, it's been a long time since the end of World War II. I think in the age of Steven Spielberg, we are democratically permitted to take the next step. And this is why I argue in favor of what Richard said. There seems to be, through back engineering, enough information to suggest that there are programs in operation that would suggest a breakaway situation, or at least a modified scenario to that end.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hurtak. Well, you know, it seems like, you know, what we are exposed to here would be science fiction by most people out there, right? I mean, we understand there's a phenomena that's beyond the ordinary paradigm, and yet there might be paradigms that are beyond some of us here. So it's like, how far do we push the envelope? And even back in 1961, the whole idea of a UFO abduction was something no one had heard of ever before, pretty much. And there was a lot of people trying to debunk what Betty and Barney Hill first came for. Can you talk about some of the resistance that you had and your family had to deal with in that first real major case? That was a breakthrough case.
Well, in the Betty and Barney Hill case, I want to state first that Betty was a social worker for the state of New Hampshire. Barney worked for the post office, but both were very active in the civil rights movement. Barney was appointed in 1965 to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights State Advisory Committee. Betty and Barney wanted their story to remain confidential. They never intended to tell that story to the public. They were willing to speak with scientists, with UFO investigators, with military officers, and they did with military officers. But that story was carried to the public as the result of a violation of confidentiality that happened in 1965. It was devastating to Betty and Barney. Barney was not reappointed to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission after that was made public. It troubled him deeply because the public began to view him, those who didn't know him, as a kook. That was not anything that he ever wanted to happen. And Betty and Barney, I have to say, had a great deal of support from the military, from military officers at Pease Air Force Base who knew that this was real, from Admiral Herbert Knowles, who lived just across the river from them. They lived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Admiral Knowles in Elliott, Maine. So there were people who knew what was going on and had their own experiences or were studying this fairly confidentially, who supported Betty and Barney. So thank goodness for that. But in terms of the general public, after this story came forward, went to the public in 1965, Philip J. Klass read in 1966 the Incident at Exeter and then The Interrupted Journey, the first book that was ever written about Betty's and Barney's case by John G. Fuller.
they had given him permission to write that book, and Dr. Benjamin Simon did. He was the hypnotist, and actually a renowned psychiatrist, neuropsychiatrist, who worked with Betty and Barney separately under hypnosis for a period of 6 months. Well, I decided that I needed to find out what motivated Philip Klass to do this dirty work. Why was it so important to him to attempt to destroy Betty's and Barney's character, to invent speculative arguments about what could have happened to them rather than paying attention to what actually did and what was in the evidence? They painted Betty and Barney with a whole new brush. And what I discovered about Philip Klass is that and I found this at the American Philosophical Society, his archival collection is there. I wondered why someone like Philip Klass would have an archival collection there. And because he had a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering, he worked as an electrical engineer for 11 years, and then he went on and became a writer and one of the editors of Space and Technology magazine out of Washington, D.C. And what I discovered is that Philip Klass was keeping company with a young man from the Soviet embassy. And the FBI was trailing him. They were watching his activities and where he went with this Russian man. And Philip Klass was under suspicion for espionage. And his apartment was searched. They were searching for radio equipment that would transmit to Eastern Europe. It's all in that's all in his FBI record. And so I started to talk with Stanton Friedman about it, and Stanton and I had worked together for 14 years. He went to the American Philosophical Society with me once. Jennifer Stein was nice enough to drive us down, and we stayed at her home on that one visit. And she went with us, and she helped us to do our research and to photograph many of those documents. The other people who have collections there are people like Dr. Edwin Condon, Robert Lowe, who ran the Colorado study on the scientific investigation of UFOs. He was the project coordinator. Dr. Donald Menzel has correspondence files there. And many of the disinformants I discovered had files there, correspondence files, that were very, very interesting. And so I believe, after speaking with Stanton, and we wrote 3 books together, and the book that we wrote on this research is Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers. We came to believe that what probably happened is that the federal government went to Philip Klass and said, we can prosecute you, but you could cooperate with us to do this job. I found evidence in the files that Donald Menzel had written to Philip Klass and said, I'm getting sick of doing this, I'm really tired of it, and I'm glad to have your assistance. I also found a letter that Donald Menzel wrote to Carl Sagan about how early in his own career he had kind of bucked the system, and that he found that after he began to follow the zeitgeist of the old guard, that he did extremely well in his career. There was a lot of great information there. So if you ever have the opportunity, I recommend that you go and do your own research. If you don't have that, yes.
Donald Menzel was on the 12 Majestic 12.
Yes, Stanton discovered that Donald Menzel, who was listed as a member of MJ12, also had a very long career with the NSA. So he was very closely connected to the federal government and worked on many government projects and was very successful, received a lot of funding for the work that he did. So what I found out, too, is that all of these men were connected very tightly. Donald Menzel and Edward Condon were fishing buddies. And they were all planning together this great cover-up. They wanted books, children's books, that referenced UFOs to be removed from bookstores. They wanted children not to be able to have UFOs as a science project in their schools. They wanted to completely put a black rubber stamp on everything. And, you know, I also found a letter that Edward Condon wrote about Philip Klass. He wrote it to the president of McGraw-Hill, the publisher that Phil Klass worked for. And he said that he recommended Philip Klass as the go-to guy for the mainstream media because Dr. James McDonald, who had been the chairman of the physics department at the University of Arizona, specialized in meteorological physics, became interested in UFOs and started to do his research, so he became co-chair of the department. And as far as Stanton was concerned, Stanton believed that he was the greatest scientist, the greatest scientific ufologist who ever lived in the work that he did. But Edward Condon pushed Philip Klass into the limelight in front to be the go-to guy for the mainstream media. And throughout the remainder of his lifetime, he lied to the American public. He had a big job to do, and that job was disinformation. Thank you.
And Professor McDonald was probably murdered because he was trying to say that the UFO was real.
That's true. Richard, you did some research.
And I also discovered that Philip Klass had fed false information to Jack Anderson, which ended up being published in the Washington Post. And that false information was that McDonald was misusing Navy, Office of Naval Research funds to do cloud research in Australia. And because supposedly McDonald was over there investigating UFOs. Well, that was an investigation. He was exonerated, but Philip Klass wrote a letter and to the Office of Naval Research, and he said, if you give any more funding to Dr. James McDonald, I will take this to Congress. So there was a threat there. And he set McDonald up to take a fall. And I am convinced if McDonald wasn't killed, that he was driven to suicide.
Wow. Either one. Yeah. Wow. Wow. Thank you for that piece, because that was news to like veterans here, like Linda. But anyway, it's up to you, Jan. The answer. No, you're the answer. No, because you know you're in touch with To the Stars Academy. So are some other people here, and you've been on, investigating the MUFON. But is there a crack in this cover-up conspiracy by what you're seeing?
Well, I think your question is there a secret space program?
Well, and yes, and what's being revealed about it all.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
Go ahead.
I was going to say yes and then sit down, but
Okay. What do you know about it?
I know nothing. Look, I mean, Richard hit the nail on the head. Absolutely, there's a secret space program. We know from the NRO putting satellites into space. We know from the space shuttle putting classified missions into space. I have a close friend who's a former astronaut who one of his two missions that he flew on. Sorry, one of the two missions he flew on was a classified mission where he they were putting a satellite in space, which was for, he never told me for who, but I assume it was for the DIA or for one of the military branches. We also know that the Air Force has the X-37B. When I was working with IBM at Boeing back in the mid-90s, there was a craft out in the Bay Area that I used to look at, and I'd ask people, what is that thing? They said, that's the X-37B. I didn't know what an X-37B was, but now we know the Air Force flies this thing for 2 years up in orbit. We have no idea what it does, but it's a secret space program. It's their secret space program, and we have no need to know. So, I mean, we might just touch upon, why is some of this stuff kept secret from us? And I think the main reason is not because they're trying to hide information from the public, the American public. The main reason why a lot of it's kept secret is because A, it's classified, B, it risks national security, but C, they don't want the information falling into our adversaries' hands. So they're very concerned about the Russians, the Chinese, and other folks out there getting this technology and putting it to use.
Could
Now,
it also be D, that there's a breakaway civilization that doesn't want the rest of us to know what they really have in store?
I'll take D. Anyone else want to take D? but let's stay with A, B, and C first. Okay. So a lot of people were critical of the Tic Tac videos because it was so short and it didn't show this and it didn't show that. A lot of reason that is because the actual videos originally were like 20 minutes long of these jets chasing these things. The problem is that the avionics inside the F-118 that were chasing these jets is classified information, and they didn't want that revealed to the Russians and the Chinese. So they cut it very, very short. So people criticized them for that, but it was for national security reasons. So we have to realize, our military is there to protect us. They do their own job, but I think they are trying to get the information out, and I think that's where you're trying to go to. This whole TTSA thing, the whole government. There are people within our government who want the information to come out. I mean, it's going to come out. It's only going to come out to a certain extent, and I think the extent right now is what are they and how do they work. But with regards to a secret space program, I can tell you some facts. So let's look at facts here. We know the X-37B is there. That's definitely part of a secret space program. That's the Air Force. We know that. Pretty benign. We don't know about the TR-3B. We only know that through whistleblowers, so we don't know that for fact, right? But if you look at the F-117, it was operational back in 1983, yet you and I didn't know an F-117, which is the stealth fighter that Lockheed built. Looks kind of like a bat-winged thing, weird angles on it. We didn't know that was an actual craft until 1993 during the Gulf War when we started bombing the heck out of Iraq. So a lot of this technology, the reason that is because it takes 10 to 20 years to get a leg up on your adversary. But once that technology is known, it only takes 1 or 2 years for them to duplicate it. So that's why they want to keep it secret. They don't want to give adversaries the ability to do that. So I'm not trying to make excuses for anybody, but that's what I'm told, and that's what I believe to be true. As far as a breakaway civilization, what I know for a fact, in talking to Ben Rich was the CEO of the Lockheed Skunk Works, which builds all the top secret spy planes. And I had the opportunity in '93 to go to a UCLA engineering alumni event where he spoke. He just retired from Lockheed, and he was addressing the engineering alumni that were there, that were donors to the school, basically. And so in that talk, he went through his 40 years at the Lockheed Skunk Works. It was great, from the U-2 spy plane, the SR-71, which made him famous and put him in line to take over from Kelly Johnson as the CEO, and then all the way up through basically the F-117, which at that time, '93, it had been already done for 10 years, right? What I find fascinating, just to take a sidetrack here, is that it's now been, 36 years since the Lockheed Skunk Works has had a product come out? I mean, what have they been doing for 36 years? Nothing? Yeah. So there's something out there. But what Ben said was the breakthrough for them to get the F-117 to be invisible to radar was a Russian mathematician's equations for stealth. And they looked at those equations, and the engineers at Lockheed Skunk Works said, if we built a craft that looked like this, we would be able to be invisible to radar. And that's how the F-117 came about. In fact, it was so outside of the box that Kelly Johnson admonished Ben Rich for that is the ugliest airplane I've ever seen, and I don't even think it'll fly. But it did, and it did exactly what it was supposed to do. But it was through equations, so think about that. Now, in his talk, the last slide he had was a black disk zipping off into outer space, and he ended his talk by saying, we now have the technology to take ET home. And everyone burst out laughing. There were about 200 people in the room. They all started laughing. I was sitting in the front row with Tom Keller, and we just looked at each other and said, did he just say that? Did he really just say that?
It wasn't a joke.
Well, it was not a joke, but everyone took it as a joke. And so about 15 of us went up afterwards to talk to him privately, and he did reveal some things. And basically what he said, I'm just going to paraphrase it, short it down here, is that there's been an error in the equations. He wouldn't tell us what. I did ask him directly what equations. And we have discovered the error, and we now know how to travel to the stars, and it won't take us our lifetime to do it. So he was very emphatic that this was definitely doable. He said that.
Not only doable,
So
but
that's-
doable and done.
Well, see,
I won't take a lifetime to do it. I always assume won't take a lifetime to get to the stars, right?
correct, yes.
That's what he
That's
meant.
correct, yeah.
Not for us to build
Right,
it, but to get
right.
to the stars.
So if you have the equations, now there was only one physicist, when this came out years later, because I didn't immediately tell people about it. I was concerned, frankly, for my life, because, I mean, you've got stuff he's telling us that is basically national security implications. But when it finally came out, and it came out in print, I got a call from one physicist in the world, and it was Hal Puthoff, and he wanted to know, what did Ben Rich say? I want the exact words. And he had me go through, word by word by word, everything he said. Because one of the other things he said was that I chased him out at the end because he was going to go to his car, and I was following out. And I said, Ben. I said, I'm Jan, and he's looking at me like, who are you? And I said, I'm very fascinated by this whole thing and what you were just talking about, because he spent quite a bit of time talking to us about this whole thing. And I said, can you tell me exactly how this works? And he looked at me like, who are you again? And he says, well, let me ask you a question. How does ESP work? And I thought, I took like 3 steps back. I didn't expect a question to my question. And so I blurted out the first thing that came to my mind. I said, well, I don't know. All points in space and time are connected. He said, that's how it works. He turned around and walked away. So now that tells you that there's a paranormal psi aspect to this whole thing, right? So anyway, going back to Hal Puthoff, in October of 2017, when To the Stars announced the formation of this new entity called To the Stars, Hal was one of the 6, 7 people, I don't remember exactly, on stage with Tom DeLonge and Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon and other people. I called him the next day, and I said, Hal, congratulations, you've come out of the closet. Like now maybe you could speak at a MUFON symposium, right? Because he's got classified projects he works on, and it's hard for him to speak publicly about this stuff. And I said to him, well, what happened? And he said, well, we figured out the error in the equations. I said, oh, okay. And he started explaining it to me. Now, I'm not a physicist, but he tried to explain it to me. But basically what he said was they're ripping small holes in space-time, and that's how they're getting here. And we know how they're doing it. He says, now, we can duplicate it, but it's going to take a lot of money and a lot of time. You either need a large mass or you need a very strong electromagnetic field to do this. Now, Jack Sarfati is saying it doesn't take those things, but that's all. If you get into discussion with these physicists, they just make your mind go crazy. But they're working on it. We know how to get this thing done. So I'm thinking that if we knew back in '93 how to get to the stars and we had the equations, we've probably built it. I mean, that's my gut. I don't have any facts to back that up, but I mean, that's what I'm listening and hearing. And one other piece of information I'll leave with you, and then I'll turn it back over to you. Our state section director, let me correct that. Our assistant state director for California, Earl Gray Anderson, his mother was the private secretary to Howard Hughes back in the 60s. As an 8-year-old kid, he was told by his mother that she would go out in the desert to a nondescript shack, get into an elevator, go 100 stories down into the ground, and down underneath there was an entire city with shopping centers, bowling alleys, complete movie theaters, and people living under the ground. That was in the 60s. So what were they doing down there? I mean, I don't think you just go down there for fun. Maybe to beat the heat, maybe, huh?
Where was this happening?
This is out in the Mojave Desert, right? Yeah. So there's a lot of, I mean, he wouldn't be lying. I mean, he was told this. He made the mistake as a young boy when they had a neighbor over to the house saying, hey, mommy, tell them about the underground city. And she clammed up, and she didn't talk about it since then. So there's a lot of evidence. There's things going on that are not being shown to us for whatever reason. It's of concern to me because what are they doing, and why is it we can't know? But I do believe there are forces at work to try to bring this out. We can talk about that a little bit later if you'd like, so I don't take up all the time.
That is great. Wow. Desiree has something. And then...
Well, going back in some of the history of all this, and I love the idea of almost like going into a Stargate. Actually, many of you, of course, know about Bob Lazar, and he came out with a new film, and of course that was like S4 at Area 51. But in addition, and Bob Lazar will say, he only saw the information about the vehicle, and that was the limitation of what he had. But we have a associate named Dan Burrish. How many people have heard of Dan Burrish? Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about that as well, and also Ed Teller. So Dan Burrish said he was in a different section of S4, and in that section there was an alien being. Now, some people believe this, some people don't, but he really was a top biologist, and so according to him, and another associate, Bill Uhouse, he's no longer alive. About 50 years ago plus, there was a crash in Kingman, Arizona, which is not too far from S4. And that crash allowed the government to bring across the dam and everything like that, of the Hoover Dam, over to the area of Area 51, this vehicle. And in addition to that, the beings and bodies. I think there was maybe a body or two, but also the being. Now, this being supposedly really was not in perfect shape. He wasn't this robust, alien. So one of the reasons he was there and kept in captivity was that Dan and the team, it took him a while to even get to be able to communicate with them, was to help this being to make himself healthier. Suppose he had a very serious neuropathy. And since they felt they had a genetic connection to us, they wanted some of our researchers and their kind of knowledge to be able to help improve that. Now, it never went farther in terms of Dan Burrish. He wasn't able to solve the problem. But I also wanted to point out that Bill Uhouse, who was a simulator engineer also working on the vehicles, supposedly also had said that some of the projects they were doing, one was Looking Glass, which was not to go back in time, not to do a time travel thing, but to be able to look back in time. And supposedly this is something that the aliens also had. So if you take all this together, and you obviously talk also with Bob Lazar, they were able to, as much as 50, 40, 30 years ago, start this technology to what we have today. And in addition to that, of course, then you can look at Corso, who talked about certain situations with certain types of fiber optics. And I just want to close with one other factor of why maybe we're not hearing so much about this, and I know that RIchard Dolan supports this, is that if you follow Colonel Corso, what he was doing, he wasn't putting all the technology into the government's hands, and this is confirmed also with the black budget of Lockheed, that what they were doing was putting it into corporate hands, right? And this is, Richard really can take off on this. So it's the corporations that really have some of this top secret information, and it's no longer the governments. So that doesn't mean they don't have the technology.
So you brought up Edward Teller. And during the first government-sponsored disclosure program that took place in Washington, D.C. in 1995, I showed, and you can see this on the actual film that was made of the conference, the body, a dummy body that was the type of alien that Teller was working with under top secret arrangements. It's actually in the film itself. So to my knowledge, it was the first presentation that on the highest level, Edward Teller, who was inspiring younger people to go into space and be prepared for space in the 1980s and 90s, actually was aware that trade-offs were taking place with the aliens.
Supposedly, Ed Teller was actually in direct communication with these aliens, according to Bill Uhouse, and that even though they used telepathic information, they also could speak. And so they would only come up with answers to the technology if you can get close enough to solving some of the problems. Then then they helped out. Otherwise, they kind of kept a distance.
Maybe we'll get back to that. But I also wanted to pick up on what Jan said about what Hal Puthoff said. It's going to take a lot of money to do this, and that gets back to my next level of questions about the black budget and how big the money and the missing. And we talked about this at dinner. I'd love for you, because that might be the answer, what Jan gave about where some of the money went. So please.
Yeah, I'd like to deal with that. In terms of a lot of things that were talked about here. So the privatization of the secrecy is absolutely key. We have got to get past the idea that it's a government cover-up. It is, but it isn't. And what we have now is a system of what I call legal illegality. So by which, if you're an American citizen, your tax dollars go to a system that is there to support private contractors, private corporations to study, exploit exotic technology that is non-human technology, ultimately for their profit. And the United States government provides security in terms of military secrecy protocols and provides infrastructure as well. So it's a...
Our government, shouldn't it be for us? I mean,
yeah, well, that's a great idea. It should be for us. So maybe one day we'll make it for us again. So that's how it works. So I had a long conversation, which I published in article form this summer with Dr. Kit Green, formerly of the CIA and an executive with General Motors. And a lot of you know who Kit Green is, a friend of Hal Puthoff. And it was very enlightening for me. And in fact, we're going to come back for some more interviews. He's up for it. So am I. But one thing he strongly impressed on me is he said a couple of things. So one was, after you're done working for the federal government, whatever security clearances you have, if you go off to work in private industry, you will inevitably get more and better security clearances than when you were with the CIA or with any branch of government. And I said, why? He said, well, it's simple. A, that's where all the brain power is in private industry. B, that's where all the money is. That's where all the action is. So any program that the U.S. military is engaged in that's really exotic, other than nuclear weapons technology, he said all other programs, the manpower, expertise is all in private industry. And so that includes any hypothetical, he said, UFO programs that deal with aliens. He was interesting with me, by the way. He was very coy in talking about the whole UFO thing. In my view, he was essentially saying there is a special access program dealing with UFO ET. In fact, he told me how for 25 years he had various mentors who were trying to take him under the wing and saying, I'm going to bring you in, I'm going to get you cleared for the UFO ET program. And for 25 years, Kit Green was expecting to be brought in, and he said to me that he was never brought into the program. Huge disappointment. He's mystified, but there you go. But anyway, the point that he wanted to make with me was it's in the privatized world where the action is. We had a long off-the-record conversation about the so-called Wilson document that I've been talking a lot about this year. Notes by Dr. Eric Davis of his conversation with Admiral Thomas Wilson back in 2002 about Wilson's failed attempt to get into the special access programs dealing with ET tech. If you followed anything that I've done this year, you're aware of this. And one thing Green said to me, and he had to be really careful with how he was saying this because he didn't want to put any of his friends in an awkward position regarding the authenticity of that document, which is authentic. But he was saying, well, hypothetically, of course, Wilson would not have had access to that program. But yeah, he thought he had access as head of intelligence for Joint Chiefs of Staff, but he didn't have access. And we had this long, long discussion about how buried in these, in the early 1990s, Secretary of Defense William Perry, in the first or possibly second year of the Clinton presidency, did a total reorg of the special access program system within AUSTAT, that's the Office of Special Acquisitions and Technology within the DoD, to hide those special access programs even deeper, making them basically impossible for almost any federal government employee to get at. That's the reorg that apparently Bill Perry overtook in '93. So that you just can't get at these things. What I think what TTSA is about, frankly, it's interesting that you mentioned that Puthoff said, well, we've solved the equation. So what you have is, see, those guys all know that there are big shot players in the black world, probably Lockheed Martin, probably Boeing, probably a few others, and they've got the goods on this, and they're making a bucket load of money, by the way, in black budget money. And I don't know this directly, but I would bet anything that the TTSA people want in on that.
What do you mean the black budget? The black budget government is paying those?
Well, the private contractors get an enormous amount of money through the black budget, taxpayer money, and maybe more than taxpayer money. There's a whole unofficial economy of missing money. Right, and so they all want a piece of the pie. They all want to get at that, and if they're able to white world some of this, that's their only way in. They're not going to get the classified projects because they're not needed. There's more than enough brain power in those other programs. I mean, as smart as Steve Justice and Hal Puthoff are, and those guys, and there's guys equally brilliant or more in those other programs, I would have to think. And so they want in, I think, and they're trying to figure out a strategy for getting in. That's my guess.
Would the result of that be this technology we don't know anything about, like them going to Mars? I mean, where's the results of all that black money? Where do you see it?
All that money's out the window. So Catherine Austin Fitz, who I adore and who many of you know about, Catherine she's a financial whiz. She was number 2 at HUD under George Bush Sr. and then did the right thing after that and went totally rogue and is one of the best whistleblower-style analysts that we have on the black budget. She's amazing. And Catherine says, the global financial system is open, not closed. And what does that mean? That means, like, envision a house with an open window and all the heat's going out. That's our system. So where's the money going? Well, her concept is that it's going into an off-the-grid financial system. Black budget that is in part funding. I mean, I'm sure it funds, ungodly wealthy lifestyles for a lot of the people who participate, but it also funds these types of programs. So when Donald Rumsfeld's talking about in 2001, this is when the Bush people were new, so it wasn't any skin off Rumsfeld's nose in summer of '01 to say that the Pentagon has financial discrepancies amounting to $2.6 trillion. He had then amended that to $2.3 trillion, and then came 9/11. The next day. Now, we were just chatting about this. And then I'm going to give up the mic here. I wouldn't say, therefore, that means $2.3 trillion actually went missing. What it means is a lot of money probably went missing. But when you have, let's say, 200-plus computerized accounting systems in the Pentagon, which they had at that time, we're told, that are not talking to each other, and when you have, it's like when you don't balance all of those checkbooks, all of these transactions are not properly tallied, and there's the idea is that there's a lot of duplicate transactions in there. So it's not necessarily $2+ trillion that got siphoned out, but the fact is we don't know how much got siphoned out. And just more recently, and then I'll give this up for real, Catherine and an economist named Mark Skidmore over at I think Mark's at the university, Indiana State University, I think. But he's a very interesting guy. So he's a professor, and he's listening to Catherine talk about, I think she'd gotten the number up to $6 trillion when she was doing an interview, $6 trillion of unaccounted for missing money. That's a lot of money because, like, the U.S. federal budget is a little over, I think, $2 trillion. The Pentagon alone is almost $1 trillion a year. It's like 700 plus billion. So when you're missing $6 trillion, you know, there's a lot of money. So Skidmore's listening to this, and he's like, that's ridiculous. He gets his grad students, and they have a little project of going through all of the records, the budgetary records that they can find of the U.S. government, and he's astonished by finding a whole lot more than $6 trillion of discrepancies. They got the number up to, I think, 21 trillion. That's when RT.com, RT News got them on, and a sliver of the Western mainstream media covered it and then ran far away from it. Since then, the Pentagon has sealed off any access that he and his students were getting. So now it's like a wall's up there. And he actually, I know this, he was just speculating. He says, look, that number could easily be as high as $50 trillion. But we just don't know. The bottom line is a lot of money has siphoned out of our system, and we'll probably, honestly, never know how much it is. But it's a lot. And so to fund these truly privatized black budget programs protected by the United States government military, which is their police force, I mean, how do we get at this? So I think, honestly, privatized efforts like TTSA are, I don't know that they're really going to succeed, and I don't think that their efforts are pure as driven snow, but it's efforts like that I feel should be supported to attempt to duplicate in the public realm. Now, will they actually stay unclassified? Maybe not. We don't know, but they're dealing with all kinds of friends and enemies within the classified world, and so it's a real tough game, and it's more than just getting the government to disclose. Although Tom DeLonge issued a very interesting tweet last summer, and I'm just paraphrasing, but it was something like, if you really want to get a disclosure, you need to change the laws governing access to these special access programs, because right now it's just off limits. We can't get at this stuff. That's why it's legal illegality. That's what that is.
I mean, thank you for the brain power you put into trying to figure this out for the rest of us. So, Dr. Hurtak.
So I wanted to congratulate Richard. I was saying 10 years ago I met and actually gave a paper at a European conference. Catherine was one of the other speakers, and privately we talked, and she mentioned to me at that time that upwards of $2-3 trillion could not be accounted for. But when we understand the other scenarios behind the breakaway civilization, and we think of other cosmic civilizations as having different forms of finance and how they work with special metals, as we saw in the great classical movie The Day the Earth Stood Still, where the ETs were using crystalline components for economic exchange, this becomes a secondary issue. The off-planetary societies are very well funded by the ET others. They're very well advanced and know how to deal this, shall we say, blow to our concept of democracy. So follow the work of Catherine Austin Fitts. She's, in my opinion, really the great Joan of Arc, carrying the truth that people need to listen to, because there's still freedom in this part of the world that can work great changes within without making catastrophic fallout in the economic and social world.
Sure. Once we change our society about, people having access to knowledge, then we have an open space program. Jan, and then Linda.
Well, I just wanted to share two cases that might point to the fact that we have something more advanced than what's being told to us. The first was from a TWA pilot who retired. He called me shortly after I took over MUFON, wanting to share some information. So I got him on the phone. We talked. He actually had two cases of sightings he'd had as an airline pilot. But the one he wanted to share with me that was important to him was that he was flying TWA flight from St. Louis to San Francisco late at night, and they had a mechanical problem. So they didn't get off till well after midnight. And it was about, 2 o'clock in the morning or so, out over the west somewhere where it was pitch black. All of a sudden, he noticed on the ground a three-dimensional ILS linked on. Now, an ILS is an instrument landing system. That's what airliners use to land so they don't crash short or fly over the runway and crash over there. But they're two-dimensional today. But this was a three-dimensional ILS that he saw, and he described it very, very detailed. And the next thing he and his co-pilot noticed was up in the right-hand corner of their windshield, way up high, probably in space, were these little flitting, looked like fireflies zipping around. And the next thing they saw was them going like 25 of them, boom, 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 down this ILS to the ground below. And then the ILS winked out and it went pitch black again. And he said, Jan, at that time, we were over Area 51. So now you can't fly over Area 51, but you can fly out to the side of it where the point where you can see these things coming down. So this is an airline pilot sharing this stuff, and he had never shared it before. He said, in fact, we looked at each other, and I said to my co-pilot, did you see that? And he said, no. He said, I didn't either. And so, you can't report it. I mean, if you report it, you get grounded. You can't be flying. So that's one case. The second is a Navy photographer on the Nimitz. We go back to the Nimitz, 1991, South Pacific. They're out sailing, and one of his favorite things to do was to go out to the end of the ship, the stern, at sunset and kind of watch the sunset. And so he was out there on the stern, and they blew what they call, they have a blackout. I have any Navy guys in the room, when they shut all the stuff off the ship and they make everyone go inside and lock it all down, they basically sit dead in the water. It's a drill they do for the ships to evade enemy radars. So this drill happened, and he didn't hear it because on an aircraft carrier, he was way out at the end. By the time he realized everybody else had gone in, he went to go in, and he was locked out. And he's thinking, he said, oh, crap. I'm in trouble now because I'm supposed to be in the ship, and I'm not. So as he's standing there trying to figure out how to get in, he notices rising up out of the ocean, just off the starboard side, a huge triangle come up out of the ocean, water dripping off of it. And it sits there for about 5 minutes, and he's watching this thing. And all of a sudden, it tilts up, and it shoots off into space. And eventually, the drill ended, and he got in, and the intelligence guys on board grabbed him and said, where were you? And he said, I was over here. And he said, no, you weren't. Where were you? And so basically, he lied to him, because he knew if he told him the truth, he was going to be in a lot of trouble. And they eventually let him go after quite some questioning. But he says, Jan, I don't know what that thing was. He says, but my sense was, it was ours. Now, that's his speculation, but this is his firsthand report to us from the Navy. So I just give those two cases as possibilities that there's something more going on than what we know.
No, I think that's very important, because what I'm getting from all this, back to the breakaway civilization and back to what Kathleen Marden says, maybe it's not that they're trying to keep aliens, the evidence of aliens from us, but maybe they're trying to, it's like a royal class of people, a breakaway civilization, that's trying to keep the secret technology to themselves. And that's why they don't want us to know about the aliens, because nothing to do with that. It's them honing for their own breakaway civilization, the technology to be theirs. And we're just the peasants, giving the crumbs of this technology. I mean, that's what's coming to me in this discussion. And so that makes more sense than whether or not we're asking the wrong questions. Of course there's aliens, but who's not telling us, and why are we just being given little pebbles? Anyway, that gets to your...
I can add, it was about 2.5 years ago, and John Burroughs and I were doing Phenomenon Radio. And John called me and said, I've just gotten an email and I'm sending you the link. Go to this link. And it was the CIA website. And it was a remote viewer the pages that they would do on R.A.F. Bentwaters. And we read on the phone together, and I said, I know that in terms of Project Stargate, when the remote viewers were working at Fort Meade in a old World War II barracks with the big shiny NSA building at Fort Meade in what was around 1987, 88, 89, that period of time, that LB, which was on this CIA release that we were so surprised, and it came to us just through this URL. I said, LB, the one man that I knew had been in Project Stargate was Lynn Buchanan, along with Mel Riley and several others. So I had known Lynn Buchanan for a long time, and I called him up and said, did you know, it has to be you, did you know that your Project Stargate remote viewing on Rendlesham is out on the CIA website? And he didn't, and he said none of that work was ever to be unclassified, I thought. So that led to his reading it. We did a phenomenon radio. He went through everything in the document so people could see it on the web and listen to the radio. And then we were finishing up the interview, and he said, you know, you should know something else. He said it was about 2 years, so this was 2017 that we did this interview. He said about 3 years before that, so let's take that back to somewhere around 2014, that he learned that one of their bosses back in Project Stargate, when they were in the old barracks at Fort Meade doing the remote viewing for the CIA back in the 80s, that one of his bosses had contacted Lynn and let him know that he, the boss, the old boss, was now working in the NSA on the 8th floor in an agency on interstellar trade. And Lynn said, what do you mean, interstellar trade? And that his old boss said, we are collaborating with allies, and that one of the things that we are getting, which may or may not contribute to the huge dollar issue, are rare metals that are a real problem on this planet in terms of what is inherently in the earth if it's not added to when it comes to current technology needs for rare metals. And he said that that is that the interstellar trade route has been going on for at least a couple of decades. Now, in my work with Spartan 1 and 2, the Navy SEAL and the Marine, that I'll be showing here, it's Friday, I think, they also, both of them, in work that they had done, knew that we have an interstellar trade office. And the Navy SEAL said that in one of his briefings in the work that he had to do on an extraction mission in Antarctica with the scientists there, he said that it was his understanding that we had started interstellar trade in the 70s. So the idea that it is kept from us to keep the Chinese or the Russians, I think that's part of it. But I personally do not think it's all of it, and that the power brokers on this planet may not all be Homo sapiens sapien. And that it's my own personal speculation that I think this planet is run for other reasons besides the evolution of us humans, and that is one of the big parts of the story, not just of the 20th to the 21st century, but I think for thousands, millions of years.
Well, Yeah, I also was getting that maybe the breakaway civilization is part alien in its agenda.
Well, I had a conversation with a gentleman this last summer, someone I know quite well. This is one of these stories. So this gentleman had become pretty good friends with a very high-level member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff from the Reagan era. This individual actually died just a little while ago, earlier this year. So my friend, who I've known this man for a while, got to know this high-level person and was almost never able to get him to talk about UFOs. Almost never. On a couple of occasions, very few, he was able to. This man's attitude was basically 99% of the time was, don't talk about this. This is not a good idea. This is a terrible idea. I'm not going to get into this. You don't know how dangerous it is, and so forth. But my friend is nothing if not very persistent. And in their last, I think it was their last conversation, he said, look, I'm sorry that I keep coming back to you with this, but this is an important issue. And he said, I only hope that the reasons that these secret keepers don't tell the rest of us is because they have the best interests of humanity in mind. And the only thing this man said was, I don't think they're human. That was, right? That was what he said. Tracy knows this story. And that was it. And the way that it was said, according to my friend and colleague, was he felt it was clear enough. Like, I don't think they're all human. I don't think they're human, was what he said.
Well,
I don't think they're human.
But they also might not have the best interests of humanity in mind. But I do think what's happening, what Linda talks about, soul creates, and Kathleen with the spiritual opening, Desiree and JJ, is that there's a spiritual upgrade happening, and that's sort of cracking the fabric in this secrecy structure. And Desiree, you want to talk about some of that you think is happening on a kind of spiritual level that's opening up this secret, and that's why we're all here in a way, to have new secrets, and then maybe with your questions answered.
Well, I just wanted to add, so going back to Bill Uhouse's comments on Area 51 when he was there, because they were trying to, back engineer the technology along with Bob Lazar, but this is his take on it, that actually he would sit in a room with Ed Teller, and they were going back and forth between Los Alamos and Area 51, and in addition, there would be 3 or 4 ETs that actually would come in with them. And this is back in literally the 70s, 60s and 70s. And even one of the, Bill Uhouse, and you can see this on some of the internet, would even dress up in human clothes, even though he kind of had more of a, would you say, a gray alien type of face. So they would try to be, something that could be accepted even to the engineers, because otherwise it's very odd. So, if you follow along from that, and it wasn't just one ET that was there were several ETs with Ed Teller, according to Bill Uhouse. So, and they were again trying to help us at that time with some of the equations that were missing and that were needed. So I think that's true. But I also want to go into some of the, we do believe some of the good guys, have tried to go to the government and said, put away your weapons of war. And, of course, that even came through a radio program that Dr. Hurtak had kind of talked about the day before it even happened. But, if you put away your weapons of war, we'll get you better technologies. We'll get you something that'll help the planet. And we have a friend that's doing a TV show connected with Valiant Floor, and the show itself, whatever gets developed, said, we don't need to put away our weapons of war. We still have that technology from other guys. So that was their comment.
So in that movie, he mentions Melchizedek, that there is a higher cosmic command that the great Hebrew and Christian mystics and prophets speak about. So there's another story that's completely dismissed by traditional ufologists and extraterrestrial specialists, and that is the spiritual implication of a much higher strata of intelligence that's aware of the games of the ETs who are playing games with government scientists and leaders to keep us all in this cat and mouse game where we don't know who's on first base. So again, we have to go back to the credibility of the great thinkers of Western civilization who have given us the four freedoms and the understanding that we will make it through this great, shall we say, dialectic. And it's very clear as to who's going to be for the freedom of the world, and those behind the regime in Caracas and beyond who want to bring down the curtains on the free society. Latino people basically still have the family, they still have faith, they still have the four freedoms, and they're willing to do spiritual due diligence. That has been lost largely, unfortunately, in the United States, which has become a highly materialistic civilization. So if you take away anything from this conversation tonight, is there's a higher command that's going to decide the outcome. And that higher command is going to require courage, great compassion, but also great creativity.
And putting away our weapons of war, especially nuclear.
Right. And it's up to us, I think. But you had something to say?
Yeah, we'll go to Q&A, sure. Yeah, so let's just say that you suspect that there is something wrong in Washington, and that there is this secret space program that's being operated outside of the legal part of our government. We've heard about the $2.3 trillion missing out of the budget. We've heard, I can tell you that both Chris Mellon, who was a former Secretary of Defense under both Clinton and Bush, and Lou Elizondo, who ran the ATIP program for the Pentagon, who now both are part of this TTSA organization, have told me individually, separately, not when I've asked the tough questions, that they had admin access to the black budget. They saw everything that was being allocated into what projects, and none of those projects were triangles, for instance. None of those projects were spacecraft per se. So that's what they know factually. But let's assume you think to yourself, maybe there's something fishy here, something else going on. There's two ways you can attack that. One is you could decide that you're going to create this in the white world and put an organization together to bring people together and funding together to actually make that happen. Another way to do it would be to make this UFO issue a major issue within Congress and within the House of the President, and try to get them to take action on it. Because in doing that, you might out the people who are circumventing the system and doing what they're doing. I'm not saying that's what's going on. I'm just saying I think about this a lot. Like, so what is this whole TTSA thing about? You know, what are these guys up to, right? And we all want to know, right? And I've talked to them at great lengths. I mean, they're basically trying to push the agenda that this is real. These things are going on. The military's seeing them. We need to take it seriously. We can't keep ignoring it. And they're trying to get Congress and they're trying to get the president to do something about it. For what purpose, though? I'm saying, where does that lead to? So I'll just leave it at there. My thinking says you do it in one of two ways. Either you invent it yourself, and so you prove that it's real, or you out the people who are doing it illegally.
Invent it yourself, meaning?
Well, you've got the scientists and the technology and the equations, and you go get the funding, and you go start building these stuff. You make technology.
Unless it's like what Richard says, a controlled disclosure where you've said that, where they want us to know certain things and not want us to know other things. Can you add something?
Well, just one fast postscript. I do know that there is a particular subject in which there have been for at least 10 years more than one group of people trying to do something with a specific technology in which I have been involved. And that in the white world, they cannot achieve what they need to test. And that it is being forced back into the black military world in order to do the test, because it doesn't exist, the ability in the white world. So I personally think those are some real restrictions, And yet I know that Steve Justice told me himself, he said one of our big dilemmas is that some of the most brilliant minds on this planet do not have CIA, NSA, DIA special access project clearances. And that means that just even in the world of classification and clearances, that there are so many superimposed separations that when they want a particular brilliant scientist, they can't get them. And that so this is multi-layered complex.
I would like to just add, it's a really interesting possibility. We talk about a breakaway civilization. I've talked about it for a long time, but there's another possibility. Rather than having full-fledged off-world capabilities, which we should never rule that out. But what if it is the case where our classified world is so compartmented, so honeycombed, each with its little areas that they're not making the kind of progress they could. You know, in the Wilson document written by Dr. Eric Davis, it's very clear that the people in the Special Access Program talking to Wilson, if you choose to believe it, was that their progress in trying to replicate this ET tech, it was painstakingly slow. They were not able to make the progress because the people who were read into the program was maybe, 500, 600, 700 people, which may sound like a lot, but it's not enough. And they're not able to collaborate. So there's a couple of different possibilities lurking around here. When I talk about a breakaway civilization, I just want to make it clear, I am never necessarily saying it's Star Trek level. I don't know what it is. James Goodall had his own contacts who said, yes, if you've seen it in the movies, we can do it. Been there, done that. Ben Rich supposedly said that to him, or decided it wasn't worth the effort. One of his other guys at Groom Lake, who was there for, I think, 11 years, said, we have things out there that would make George Lucas envious. We've all heard that. So you've got different things here leading us in different directions, but it could very well be that there's a lot of this classified world that is, it's like an engine that just can't keep going because they're too compartmented. Yeah.
I'm going to take some questions because somebody, yeah, thank you. Thank you for all your efforts here. Because for me, I'm convinced that a little more after this discussion that somebody knows something and they're not telling. I mean, I was convinced of that, but it's on a deeper level than I had suspected. I suppose. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Angelique, you want to have a question?
Here, we got the mic here for the question.
Okay. Here, you want to just okay. And keep them short because there's a lot of people with questions and we don't have that much time on this tape.
Good evening. My question is for RIchard Dolan. Concerning, say, something like Project Serpo, where about half a dozen people, agreed to go riding a gravitational wave over to the star constellation 9 months away, or say the Montauk Project, which was a space-time project, for Al Bielek and his brother Duncan. If you could elaborate on, do you think there are programs like those running right now, where traveling to a star system and coming back, or doing time travel to, different parts of either dimensions around here?
It's a good question. It's a tough question.
Oh, and for Linda, thank you for 40 years worth of dedicated research from 1979 to 2019. Thank you.
For sure. It's a great question. It's a hard one for me to answer. I couldn't answer it definitively. I could never answer it definitively. The first example, not the Montauk one, was Serpo. Yeah, that came out in, I think, 05, 06. I just reread it. I just reread the Serpo material just because I wanted to. And it's interesting because there's so much good detail in there. But as I was going through it again, I thought, this really could be the result of someone with a very, very good skill as a novelist. Could be. And you don't look convinced, but think about it. Anyone who's read a great novel, Tolstoy, all right, he's top of the level. But there's also many, many excellent levels where a very good story could be created. I looked at the Serpo story and I thought there were very convenient things that were not in the Serpo story, frankly. Doesn't mean it can't be true, but There's things that could be totally plausible. I'm not saying that, but it could also be the product of a very talented individual who. There's a lot of really talented fiction writers in this world. Like, we forget that. So I'm just saying that's a possibility. I'm not saying definite. But are there...
Can I just add, at least on the Reagan, just on that Reagan Camp, the Camp David, a man who has helped me a great deal in Washington, D.C., says that he knows for a fact that March 6th to 8th, 1981, Ronald Reagan was with Casey in Camp David, and they were doing a briefing on ETs.
I'll just add to that, because you've referred to that a lot. I think that's entirely possibly true. That's recited in the Serpo documents, that briefing, and it's totally plausible to me. Could be true. So, but your question's more broad, like, are there programs like that? And all I can say is, I don't know, maybe. Montauk? Yeah, that's another one where, I went to Montauk personally twice. I tried looking into it a lot. I only spoke to Duncan Cameron once. And I know he's just passed away recently. I didn't investigate any of these people in a way that others have. But it left me kind of cold, I have to just honestly say. I think there's probably something that was important about Montauk, maybe an MK Ultra type thing, but in terms of what the narrative is, I don't know. But your larger question, are there things that are potentially that radical that are out there? I would say possibly, yeah. I just don't know. Maybe.
I did receive a call from Al Bielek years ago where he wanted certain technical information, so I thought to myself, well, if he's calling me for information that he claims to have, Al Bielek is on cloud nine. I'm sorry to say that he's not in the inner team of the real scientist.
Okay, next question. You and then
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi.
Thank you.
I wanted to, again, try to put a bit of a more positive spin on things and capitalize on what Kathleen mentioned earlier, where a lot of the military folks tried to help in Benny and Barney initially right off the bat with the Admiral, and also Bob Simon, the first psychologist to interview them was a retired Army colonel, was he not?
Dr. Benjamin Simon.
Here.
And yes, he was.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Gotcha. So thank you.
Dr. Benjamin Simon was a retired Army lieutenant colonel.
Right, and he had a background in helping people deal with shell shock, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So I want to just pose to the panel a question that I pose in my book that I'll be bringing out here shortly, called Behind Human Lines, about the case for amnesty towards the military in this realm. Again, I have had a difficult time resolving that all of my buddies and brothers and sisters in arms who have taken an oath, similar to the Hippocratic Oath, so forth, to defend the country, etc. I shared with Bob Dean this before he passed about 10 years ago. I asked this question: is it possible that this secrecy, as Jan mentioned earlier, is well-intentioned? That perhaps we are allied with others that are trying to defend this planet from the 2 or 3 criminal alien species who are not abiding by the Prime Directive or any of the Galactic Federation rules that say you can't come pick people out of their beds and mess with them and slap them back in somebody else's clothing or put scars on them, so forth. Is it possible that a lot of this black activity has to be kept secret from their infiltrators who may appear as us? I just want to open that up as a possible positive spin on this, that our government may not necessarily be oppressing us, but actually be allied with another alien species to help defend the country.
Right. I just want
to help defend the planet.
My response to the Prime Directive is that that's a fabrication. It looks good on television, but we've been interfered with ongoing probably for thousands of years, and so Prime Directive, it's something someone made up, but it doesn't really exist.
I'll just add that the DIA analyst that I have talked about, his first opening paragraph to me that I've never forgotten is that he said, Linda, our government has proof. Those words are still ringing in my mind because I was stunned by what he was saying. Our government has proof that 3 competing, in conflict, extraterrestrial biological civilizations have been terraforming and harvesting and manipulating DNA on this planet as a laboratory for at least 270 million years. And when I said, what is the proof? He said, it's too dangerous for both you and me. Just know that that is something we have as proof. And then when my next statement was, well, that's before the time of the dinosaurs. And he actually said that the dinosaurs were an 85 million year laboratory experiment by what are known as the ebens, the pear-shaped grays. And the discussion was quite complex and faceted and lasted for 7 hours in December of 1999. And a lot of it has never left my mind. If nothing else but the statement, 3 competing in conflict extraterrestrial biological civilizations have mixed and matched genetic material on this planet as a laboratory, then a lot of the schizophrenic history of the Earth might be explained. But further jump to Lynn Buchanan and the remote viewers. He said all of them at some point had tasking about other consciousness in the universe. And he said we all came to the conclusion that this universe is teeming with consciousness, whatever level of consciousness that might be. And he said, we also all got that if we didn't have allies, we wouldn't be here, because there are hostiles that, for reasons that are not clear, want to annihilate life on this planet, and that there are a lot of neutrals. The complexities of what the remote viewers have gotten adds to the confusion of why can we not be just told straight out, here are allies, here are hostiles, here are neutrals, and educate the population. And that is the part that to me is a puzzle.
I just want to do a quick follow-up on that because I think it's a really great question. I would jump out and just say right off the bat, back in 1947, let's just say, the Truman administration had every reason for secrecy. Absolutely every reason for initiating secrecy. As much as we would want it otherwise, it's not hard to see why they would do it. You acquire some tech and some bodies. You don't want the Russians to get it. You don't want other people to get it. You want to find out. You don't even know what to tell the world at this point, friend or foe. You're worried about panic. You're worried about all the implications, and you need to understand it. And so you would definitely have a classified group of people to study this and maybe make another decision in 5 years and decide where to go from there. And what I think would definitely happen with any kind of secrecy like that is that it would develop its own momentum, its own profitability, its own reason to be. And so that's probably the primary thing. But your question's still germane, which is today, right now, are there legitimate reasons that could exist? And I would say absolutely they could exist. Absolutely. If you're dealing with a truly hostile other intelligence, even if there's many good ones, if there's one bad one, and that seems to be the quiet word on the street, if that is true, and if they can enter your encrypted communication systems with ease, and then you've got to be ultra careful. The only question, like the nightmare, would be how to do it, how actually to evade their intelligence. And it just doesn't make sense to me that it's helped at this point by hiding it from the rest of the world. Like, that doesn't make any sense to me at this point. Maybe there's a logic to it, but I can't see it. I can't see that. And also it hinders us. It hinders the black projects that are not communicating with each other. Like, that's the other downside of it, arguably.
My gosh, thank you for this amazing panel. It really adds a lot of depth and breadth, and it's incredible. And I guess it's such a complex issue. We can't expect it to be so simple. We see things like Blackwater and how even in wars on Earth, there's so much privatization and so much hidden away. How could it not occur in space? And very possibly the same people who want the underground cities and bunkers are going off-world. My question on this panel, because we get so much, even in this community, different ideas, what are your thoughts on the moon landing? There are people that think we never got there. There's people that think that we got there and met aliens on the other side, and maybe that's who we're trading with. Just a quick...
Yeah, we went to the moon. That's the bottom line. So here's the thing. Within 5 years, we're supposed to be back on the moon. I'll give them 15 because I don't think we'll make the time frame. But in 15 years, when we're back on the moon, when the LEMs landed on the moon, the LEM was the Lunar Excursion Module. It had two parts to it. It landed on the moon, and when it took off, it left the bottom half there. So if we did, in fact, land on the moon, when we get back, we'll be able to find those landers there. If they're not there, we never landed on the moon. But we'll then be on the moon, so we'll have landed on the moon. So we landed on the moon. All right. How's that for logic?
I do think people who say that we haven't landed on the moon are putting out disinformation, and we've obviously maybe gone much further than the moon, right? Okay, Desiree.
And forgive me, one other thought. Since China announced that they wanted to build an artificial moon and put that out in the media.
Time's up. Yeah. I just want to say Dr. Hurtak and I worked closely for a while with Buzz Aldrin, who was, of course, the second man to kind of go to the moon. He definitely would affirm that. In addition to that, we worked closely and also with Alan Edgar Mitchell. He was definitely connected with the moon. And then also the last person, the geologist, Harrison Schmidt, who was a geologist who went to the moon. And we do have moon rock, if anyone wants to look at that, which is somewhat unique. So we do believe we went to the moon. But I have to say, also, there have been a lot of remote viewing, even going back to Ingo Swann and others, that there are bases on the backside of the moon. And the very fact of the way the moon rotates is actually very interesting, because it kind of blocked us for a long time as a civilization from understanding orbits and circuit. That's why we thought that we were not orbiting, because we couldn't see how the moon would be orbiting. So there's a lot with the moon, but we definitely have already been there. Maybe the reason we haven't gone back is those bases.
I think it's an artificial satellite that somebody, some great civilization, put there to balance the atmosphere. But okay, just to wrap up here, why don't we just start here and say, I'm convinced that there is somebody who knows something that they're not telling us, and what are we going to do about it? Where do we stand? What does the future look like for human civilization in terms of letting out the secret that you want to have as a headline on the New York Times? Stand up, Lindsay.
Yeah.
What's the solution? What can we do, and what's the solution?
That is it's like the primal question.
Right.
And I have been doing dinner bets since a year ago, and have two more that we're going to have that headline, "We're not alone in this universe," because I frankly do not see how Homo sapiens sapien is going to continue evolving into the future unless we are stopped being coddled, kept deliberately dumb. And if humans are not allowed the truth, then I think in the end that weakens us to the point that we will easily be annihilated. If we are told all of the truth about the worst hostility, about whether or not this is a holographic universe that is projected from another dimension, and then a whole other question about who the hell are we really, and what is the relationship between matter, life, and consciousness, which I frankly think is the big enchilada in this universe. It's only with being finally told the truth and we're all put on the same square that I think then we will be strengthened enough to keep going. That is what I worry about the most. And if there are hostile intelligences that want us to remain dumb and blind, and they are part of the fabric and the power brokers keeping us dumb and blind, I do not know what the answer is to that schizophrenic situation, except that I do think there is a divine field, and there may be something about the souls of humanity itself that somebody wants us to survive, even though we're being kept dumb and blind. And Alan's question is, how do we as a population on the earth, how do we ever reach ourselves onto a playing ground that is the same if there are non-human and human power brokers who want to keep us dumb and stupid and blind? That, to me, this is where the rubber hits the road now, because I think tremendous number of forces want to keep us from knowing anything. And that I and everybody here, this is what keeps us going, why I work so hard, is I think we deserve the truth. If we aren't given the truth, then we are an abused species.
Well, you know, I don't have any necessarily data to back it up, but I do believe that our technology is very, very advanced from a space standpoint. The fact we probably have stargates, we probably have advanced craft that can travel interstellar. That's my personal belief. It's not anything I have a fact to, but just from what I can see and what I can hear. The only way we're ever going to get to know that, in my opinion, is to rediscover it in the white world. It's not going to come to us through the black world. There's just no way it can come that way. So I think that's what we need to be hoping for, we need to be cheering for, is funding some of these scientists, these people who have the understanding of the equations and everything else, so that they can help create it for us in the white world. That way we'll bring the two together, in my opinion.
How do we do that? How do we...
Funding. You need Congress to vote money to it. You need people to be funded.
We need a white world interstellar trade.
Yeah, right, exactly.
We need to define the trillion that was been...
Yeah, it's in my bank account. I didn't want to tell you. Okay. But I wanted to just answer, John had a good question, I think, earlier, and I want to just final on that. You know, why don't they tell us, you know? And when the TTSA guys announced things back in October 2017, one of the things Tom DeLonge said at the beginning of his talk was, there are things that have been kept secret that never should have been kept secret. There are things that were secret then and should have been kept secret then, but don't need to be secret now. But there are things out there that are so would cause us such grief that they should never be known. And of course, the first thing in my mind was, well, what are those? Tell me that stuff. I want to know that stuff. So I want to just use an analogy here. Back at 9/11, when that happened, I mean, it was a horrific event. It affected each of us in our own way, but in a horrific way. I asked Joe McMoneagle, who runs the Monroe Institute now, married to the previous guy's daughter, but I asked him, I said, Joe, how could that possibly happen? I mean, you know, we got all these remote viewers, we got all this stuff, we should know this stuff, right? And he said, well, Jen, it was a breakdown in the system. And he said, if people understood how many times we actually catch the threats, they would be astounded. But he says, we don't tell people that. We don't tell them when we stop a nuclear bomb going off in Los Angeles. We don't tell them this, because if we did, it would paralyze the entire population. They would never get on a plane. They would never go out of their home. They would lock themselves in a closet, and they would stay there. So we don't tell them. So perhaps John's premise that there's something else going on could be a possibility. It's always a possibility. But that was from Joe McMoneagle.
Thank you, Jan.
I like what Linda and Jan both said. So there's two answers to the basic question of, like, what does humanity do? One is the secret humanity is dealing with this in the way that they obviously deem fit. So they're doing what they're doing for their survival, and maybe if we're just lucky enough, they throw us some crumbs and protect us the way that you're saying. That would be awesome. But the other part of it is that I'm going to talk about this actually on our last day. Was that Saturday? Where I talk about money and mind control over this whole system. and really mind control. So what's happening is we're in a world where we are us absolutely, totally, completely under a whole array of types of controls, from financial, social, economic, and mental, and many more. And in that system, like if we're ever going to break the logjam for us to understand this, we have got to find a way to, like, I've said this many times, like, I don't really want disclosure if I'm going to have disclosure in a world that's run by a 24/7 surveillance authoritarian state that monitors my every move and takes all of my freedoms away. Like, sorry, I'm opting out. I don't care about disclosure if I have to live in that kind of a world. So for me, it's critical that we retain every ounce of freedom that we're able to retain in the next 20, 30 years. And that means disclosure has to come as a result of initiative of people. Like, you're never going to get freedom handed to you. Like, it really is true that freedom is only obtained when we fight for it. You have to fight for it because it'll never happen any other way. You've got to bring something to the table that the other party has to respect. And what we honestly need, truthfully, is, like, I don't really see our society moving in a direction of greater enlightenment. Some people see that. I see that. I don't see that. But what I do think is there's a ever-growing little bubble of people who are aware. And what we really need, honestly, is we need leadership. Like, someone's got to step up and move this forward. It can't just be an amorphous Occupy Wall Street kind of a thing. That will fail. So there's got to be directed, focused vision, and it's got to be persistent, and that's the only way. Yeah, I've heard the distinction between confirmation and disclosure. To me, that's semantics. Fine, confirmation. We're getting confirmation, but what we need is, yes, that's just another way of looking at it. I mean, we need confirmed. We need our political system to be in line with us, and we need to force it. People say, who cares what the government says? Matters what the government says because it's supposed to be responsible to you. And okay, we're running out of time. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
I'll make this very brief. I can't predict the future, but I can observe the population now. And I suspect that it will remain in the future, that there will be intelligent, curious individuals like all of you who will learn as much as we possibly can about what is truly going on. But I have to tell you that I spoke at a conference. It was a UFO festival over the summer, and one of my topics was the ATIP program. And I asked for a show of hands from the audience on how many people were aware of what appeared about the ATIP program on the front page of the New York Times on December 16, 2017. 2 hands went up, and there were approximately 250 people in the audience. I was surprised that those people were even in the audience, and I was very pleased that they were beginning to open their minds to learn more. But I was shocked at the same time. Thank you.
We're going to talk together. Well, actually, I'm happy. We're going to end on a positive note. We've talked to many people, even on the boat, that aren't in our group, and when we mention what we're doing here, they're all really positive. They're all saying, yes, UFOs, and they've all listened and watched a lot of these things that have gone on. And I just want to say, like Edgar Mitchell, that if they really wanted to wipe us out, they could, And so we feel, on a very high positive note, that we have been protected, that we're still being watched and protected. The Fukushima situation, the anti-nuclear that they've shown us is all trying to help us move forward. Who's connected with the government? Probably not the best guys, but also, on the other hand, I don't think it's the worst guys. So I think we are moving ahead as a civilization, as a culture, and Dr. Hurtak.
Okay, so we're making this quantum leap from humankind to spacekind. What Christ exemplified as the man-God partnership will be happening as we graduate into cosmic citizens. I've worked with the cosmic others. I've seen them. The majority are positive. They're going to help us. So keep the faith, keep your consciousness high, and score with the four freedoms, because that's the whole foundation of the great civilization that produced the Renaissance, the great thinkers, the great musicians, and the Christ within the higher consciousness.
Thank you, Dr. Hurtak. Thank you all. I think it's up to us. I think the answers are us evolving, redefining who we are as human beings, realizing that we're of the cosmos. We're not isolated on Earth, and our mind can reach the stars, and we maybe are the ones we've been waiting for.